Welcome back to The Bible is Art, where we explore the literary artistry of the Bible. And in this week, we're looking at John chapter 21, the last strange chapter in John's Gospel. I love John 21, the last chapter in John's Gospel. And I love it because it's weird and there are a lot of things to figure out. So let's review what John 21 is about. After Jesus' resurrection, 7 of his disciples go fishing during the night. They're unfruitful in their work, not catching any fish. But in the morning, a man calls out to them from the land and gives them instructions how to fish better. And then their catch is enormous. Realizing that the man who gave them the instructions is Jesus, Peter puts on his clothes and jumps into the water to swim to him. The disciples then have a meal with Jesus, and after the meal, Jesus gives Peter work to do, feeding and ruling over animals and sheep. The final episode in the scene is on a path following Jesus. So that's John 21. And there are many things that are puzzling about this story. First, the existence of the story itself is puzzling. That is because it seemed like the book of John should have ended at the end of the previous scene. I mean, listen to the last verses of John 20. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That sounds like a grand conclusion, but John adds a whole nother scene. Why? Another thing that's puzzling is why this long section about fishing and how to fish? Or why does Peter put on his clothes to jump into the water? Why 7 disciples? Why don't they recognize Jesus? Why is there 153 fish? And so on. Much like chapter 32 in Moby Dick, where Ishmael catalogs whale species to the boredom of readers throughout history, there's a reason for it. The author means for it to feel out of place because that encourages readers to engage with the story more deeply. Now, most of the time when you don't understand something in the Bible, it's because you haven't understood something that has come before. And to understand what John is doing with this last scene, we have to review some of the story of John's Gospel. So, John opens his Gospel with the strongest allusion to the first chapter of the Bible, in the beginning. And this is because in John's Gospel, Jesus is bringing a new creation. There are allusions to Genesis 1 through 3 all throughout John. For instance, John opens his gospel with 7 days. And much like John's other book, Revelation, where you have 7 seals that give way to 7 bowls, to give way to 7 trumpets, that is, 7 following or opening up to 7 more things, these first 7 days climax with the first of 7 signs or miracles in John's Gospel. And these 7 signs allude to the 7 days of creation week. By these acts, Jesus is making a new creation. But if you remember back to the beginning of the Bible, Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, and an angel with a fiery sword was set outside to protect the garden from intruders. So in order to get back into the garden to be with God and to start over, someone needs to go through that fiery sword. And that is exactly what Jesus does. He dies. And actually, John gives more attention to Jesus's clothing, or lack thereof, than to the actual crucifixion, partly because Jesus is disrobing, becoming like Adam, a new Adam. Well, Jesus dies and wakes up, and John tells us he wakes up in a garden. Indeed, Mary even thinks that Jesus is the gardener, and that's because he is. He is a new Adam tending his garden. Jesus will then breathe on the disciples, imparting the Holy Spirit, just like God did to Adam in Genesis 2. That is, Jesus has recreated the world, re-entered the garden, and now he's recreating humanity. Well, now here is where our chapter, the last chapter in John, chapter 21, comes in. And if you remember in Genesis 2, God creates Adam outside the garden, breathes life into him, and then puts him in the garden in a new place. In John, Jesus has breathed into the disciples, and in chapter 21, he's bringing them into a new creation. But this is not just about the disciples. John tells us that there are 7 disciples. And in the second verse of our chapter, John lists these: Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and the 2 other of his disciples. And he does this because they are representative of humanity. 7 disciples to represent the full new humanity. So John 21 begins like the old world began in Genesis 1. It is dark, watery, and their work is fruitless. Remember, in Genesis 1 and verse 2, before the 6 days of creating the world, darkness was over the water. It was disordered, just like the disordered, fruitless work of the disciples fishing. The next thing that happens in the creation week is God creating light. And in John 21, we are told that day breaks. Light. And when the light is turned on, Jesus' words will bring order, just like God's words in Genesis 1. They bring life and fruitful work to the disciples, and now they can fish properly. In one of the most beautiful and playful images of baptism, Peter flings himself into the water and swims to land where Jesus is, the new world. Peter undergoes that pre-creational disordered plunge into the water and arrives in a new land. Now you may be thinking, that seems a bit of a stretch. But one of the themes of John's gospel is the depth, the enchantment of mundane things. You see, Jesus is constantly trying to teach people, but they only see literal things and not the deeper things that they signify. For instance, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple," but the people didn't know he was talking about his body. They thought he was just talking about the physical temple. Jesus tells Nicodemus to be born again, and he thinks he's talking about physical birth. With the woman at the well, Jesus will tell the disciples that he has food that they don't know about, and they think he's talking about physical food. This is because the Gospel of John is about Jesus revealing God hidden within Jesus' flesh. So just as we must learn how to see Jesus as more than a physical man, Jesus and John literarily teach us that by showing that the physical things that happen unveil depths and are almost always saying more than the obvious physical realities. The temple is not just the temple. Birth is not just birth. Food is not just food. And if we have learned what John has been trying to teach us by the last scene in the gospel, fishing is not just fishing. Night is not just night. And water is not just water. So this new humanity represented by the 7 disciples is ushered into a new creation. The new day that Jesus has brought. And if it is a new creation like the old, then they will need work to do. It is not surprising that the main topic of discussion between them and Jesus is their work. More specifically, how to handle fish and sheep, water and land animals. Remember, Adam's job was to rule over animals, and that is precisely what Jesus is instructing the disciples to do. But here it is escalated or clarified because the fish and sheep represent people. So in this culminating scene in John 21, Jesus brings the sevenfold new humanity into a new world through this baptism, feasting with them and giving them work to do. And this, my friends, is why the Bible is art. Thank you all so much for watching the video. Welcome to the new subscribers recently. I really appreciate all your guys' support. If you would like to support the channel, that would be wonderful. You can do so at patreon.com/thebibleisart. A few random announcements. One is I recently launched a webpage that has all the sort of best audio resources, whether they're lectures, courses, sermons, things like that. And you can like filter it according to whether it's paid or free, the teacher, and the book of the Bible. It's the best stuff I've been able to find, and I put it all together in a sort of easy way. I would love if you would check that out. That's at bibleisart.com/audio. And if you have any resources that you want me to consider adding in there, I would love to see them in there, and there's a button that you can click to like submit a resource. That's the first thing. The second thing is I recently published an article over at the Theopolis blog. That's theopolis.com/blog. It's about Matthew 13 and the fascinating stuff Matthew is doing there in the center of his gospel. And I'll link that up below. I really appreciate everything, guys. Thank you so much, and I will see you later.